Patients and medics surveyed the damage after 2 Israeli missiles hit a major Gaza hospital in the early hours of Sunday. The strikes destroyed the emergency and reception department and on-site church, medics said. Israel said it was targeting Hamas fighters exploiting the facility to plan attacks. The Al Ali Arab Baptist Hospital said it evacuated patients from the compound after a phone call from someone who identified himself as Israeli security shortly before the attack. No casualties were reported, but the hospital was knocked out of operation, according to Gaza's health ministry. A health ministry spokesperson said it left hundreds of patients out on the street without medical care. Separate strikes on the enclave on Sunday killed more than a dozen Palestinians, according to Hamas and the health authorities. Medics reported that 6 brothers were killed when an Israeli strike hit their car in central Gaza. People were seen mourning the brothers in Deir al-Balah. Their father said they were not fighters and had been volunteering to make food for Palestinians in the area. What did they do wrong, he asked. Sunday's strikes came as Hamas leaders began a fresh round of talks in Cairo, in a bid to salvage a stalled ceasefire agreement with Israel. Egypt, Qatar, and the United States have stepped up efforts to bridge gaps between the sides.
A U.S. immigration judge ruled on Friday that Columbia student and Palestinian activist Mahmoud Khalil can be deported, allowing President Donald Trump's administration to proceed with its efforts to deport Khalil, who was arrested in New York City a month ago, but has not been charged with a crime. A group of supporters of Khalil spoke to media after the ruling.
This is a blatant violation of the First Amendment and a dangerous precedent for anyone who believes in free speech and political expression.
The ruling by Judge Jamie Comins of the LaSalle Immigration Court in rural Louisiana was not a final determination of Khalil's fate, but it represented a significant victory for Trump in his efforts to deport outspoken pro-Palestinian foreign students who are in the U.S. legally. Citing the 1952 Immigration and Nationality Act, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio determined last month that Khalil could harm American foreign policy interests and should be deported for his, quote, otherwise lawful speech and activism. Comins' decision followed a combative 90-minute hearing in a court housed inside a privately run immigration detention center. Members of Khalil's legal team, who say they were given less than 48 hours to review a letter and evidence submitted by Rubio, expressed their dismay during a video press conference.
It was the epitome of the lack of due process in a court proceeding in this country. It was shocking.
Today was historic in its unfairness.
A number of U.S. officials took to social media to express support for Comins' decision.
This is a movement, an anti-war movement.
Khalil is a prominent figure in the pro-Palestinian student protest movement that has roiled Columbia's New York City campus. He was born in a Palestinian refugee camp in Syria, holds Algerian citizenship, and became a U.S. lawful permanent resident last year. Khalil's wife is a U.S. citizen. She will soon give birth to the couple's first child. Khalil has said criticism of the U.S. government's support of Israel's military occupation of Palestinian territories is being wrongly conflated with anti-Semitism. For now, Khalil will remain in the Louisiana jail. Comins gave his legal team until April 23rd to apply for relief before she considers whether to issue a deportation order. An immigration judge can rule that a migrant cannot be deported because of possible persecution in a home country, among other limited grounds. In a separate case in New Jersey, a U.S. district judge has blocked deportation while he considers Khalil's claims that his arrest was made in violation of the U.S. Constitution's First Amendment protections for freedom of speech.
President Donald Trump's administration granted exclusions from steep reciprocal tariffs on smartphones, computers, and some other electronics imported largely from China, providing a big break to tech companies that rely on imported products. In a notice to shippers late on Friday, U.S. Customs and Border Protection published a list of tariff codes excluded from the import taxes retroactive to April 5th, covering 20 broad product categories such as computers, laptops, disk drives, automatic data processing, and more. While the White House did not explain the move, a spokesperson said the exclusion only applies to Trump's reciprocal tariffs on Chinese goods, which climbed to 125% this week. Trump's action also excludes the specified electronics from his 10% baseline tariffs on goods from most other countries, easing import costs for semiconductors from Taiwan and Apple iPhones produced in India. The president's 20% duties on all Chinese imports, which he said were related to the U.S. fentanyl crisis, remain in place. White House spokesperson Carolyn Leavitt said in a separate statement that Trump has made it clear the U.S. cannot rely on China to manufacture critical technologies such as semiconductors, chips, smartphones, and laptops. She added that at Trump's direction, major tech firms including Apple and chip makers NVIDIA and Taiwan Semiconductor, quote, are hustling to onshore their manufacturing in the United States as soon as possible. The exemptions suggest an increased awareness within the Trump administration of the pain that his tariffs had in store for inflation-weary consumers, especially on popular products like smartphones. Analysts predicted that the price of a top-end Apple iPhone could jump to $2,300 from $1,599 with a 54% tariff rate. At 125%, economists and analysts have said that U.S.-China trade could largely halt. Earlier this week, financial markets were in turmoil as Trump announced sweeping reciprocal tariffs on U.S. trading partners. Trump's tariff policies have raised fears of a U.S. recession and drew criticism from his fellow Republicans.
Brice Oligui Nguema, who led a coup in Gabon in August 2023, won Saturday's presidential election in the Central African country. Interior Minister Herman Imongo announced the result on Sunday, saying Nguema received 90.35% of votes cast, according to provisional results. The result cements Nguema's grip on power 19 months after the coup ended more than half a century of rule by the Bongo family in Gabon, an oil-producing nation with a population of around 2.5 million people, a third of whom live in poverty. Nguema pitched himself as a change agent, cracking down on the corrupt old guard. His most prominent opponent in the 8-candidate race was Alain Claude Billy Nze, who was serving as prime minister under President Ali Bongo at the time of the coup. Nze finished with 3% of the total votes, according to the results announced. Nguema vowed to diversify the oil-reliant economy and promote agriculture, industry, and tourism. Gabon's economy grew by 2.9% in 2024, up from 2.4% in 2023. Driven in part by infrastructure projects and increased production of commodities, such as oil, manganese, and timber, according to the World Bank. Under a constitution approved last November, Nguema's election win gives him a 7-year term, renewable once. Though he has promised a break from the Bongo era, in which elites were accused of hogging Gabon's oil wealth, Nguema himself has ties to the old government. He is a former aide to Ali Bongo's father, Omar Bongo, who served as president for more than 40 years until his death in 2009.
Began at dawn on Saturday in Gabon's presidential election. The crucial poll comes after a coup reshaped the oil-rich Central African nation's political landscape. 19 months after overthrowing President Ali Bongo, whose family ruled Gabon for more than half a century, Gabon's coup leader, Brice Oligui Nguema, was widely favoured to win Saturday's presidential poll. Nguema has been interim leader since leading the coup. The former army general has campaigned across Gabon wearing a baseball cap with the slogan, "We build together." Nguema has vowed to diversify the oil-reliant economy and promote agriculture, industry and tourism. Casting his vote, he said he was very confident of victory in the election. Across the capital city, visual reminders of the Bongo era persist. The skyline remains dotted with development projects initiated under the former regime. They were often touted as modernisation efforts despite widespread poverty. The transitional government has promised reforms and a return to civilian rule, but some experts remain cautious about the prospects for genuine change.
Chinese trade felt the effects of Donald Trump's tariffs even before the levies kicked in. Figures out Monday showed exports surged over 12% on the year in March. That was around 3 times the increase forecast by analysts. The numbers suggest factories were rushing out shipments before the tariffs took effect. However, the figures could now plunge, with China facing levies of up to 145% on most shipments to the US. One economist told Reuters it could be years before the export numbers return to the level seen in March. Monday's figures also pointed to weak domestic demand in China, with imports falling 4.3%, or more than double the decline that was forecast. That means policymakers could struggle to make up for any downturn sparked by a drop in exports. Economists at Goldman Sachs and Citi have already cut their growth forecasts for China as a result of the trade turmoil. One market expert said a plunge in soybean imports, much of which come from the US, suggested state firms in China were already shunning American produce. Overall, Beijing's trade surplus with the US rose to almost $77 billion during the first quarter. That's likely to keep the country in Trump's sights, given that closing the gap is at the top of his agenda. With China vowing to fight US tariffs to the end, Monday's figures don't bode well for any easing in tensions. Tech shares led Asian stocks higher on Monday after Donald Trump's move to exclude smartphones and some other goods from his tariffs. Japan's Nikkei index jumped over 1.5% by early afternoon. Tech gear makers TDK and Advantest were among the top gainers, rising over 5%. Shares in China did even better, with Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index gaining around 2.5% during the morning. E-commerce titan Alibaba jumped over 5%. Trump's move is a boon for firms like Apple, which makes most of its iPhones in China. But confusion still reigns over what exactly Washington plans to do next. Speaking to reporters late Sunday, Trump said chips and other goods would still face new duties.
But the tariffs will be in place in the not distant future because, as you know, like we did with steel, like we did with automobiles, like we did with aluminum, which are now fully on, we'll be doing that with semiconductors, with chips, and numerous other things. And that'll take place in the very near future.
Trump said he would announce the rate for semiconductors over the coming week. He said there would be flexibility for some firms in the sector, without giving any names. In an earlier social media post, he said nobody is getting off the hook. He said smartphones and other goods were not getting a permanent exemption, but would just move to a different tariff bucket. Many investors have voiced frustration at the constant shifts in policy. Billionaire hedge fund boss Ray Dalio said Sunday that the US was now very close to a recession as a result of the trade turmoil. Even so, Monday saw signs of tentative relief across financial markets. Prices eased for traditional safe havens including gold and the Swiss franc. The US dollar broadly steadied against key currencies, but remained near the 3-year lows touched on Friday.
A rally in technology stocks helped lift European shares on Monday. That's after US President Donald Trump granted exclusions from steep China tariffs on smartphones and computers. It provided markets a breather following weeks of sharp fluctuations. The Pan-European Stoxx 600 was up over 2% mid-morning after a third consecutive week in the red. Shares of chip-related companies Infineon, ASML and BE Semiconductor rose after Trump's Saturday announcement of these tariff exclusions. Trump said on Sunday that tariffs on semiconductors would be announced over the next week, and that a decision on phones would be made, quote, soon. An analyst suggested this could mark the start of a, quote, negotiation phase on tariffs. Weeks of back and forth over tariffs have rattled global markets, dragging the benchmark index down roughly 12% from its record closing high. And Goldman Sachs cut its 12-month forecast on the Stoxx 600 for the second time this month, and said it, quote, anticipated more downgrades. It cautioned that US tariffs and a stronger euro could hurt corporate Europe's earnings. The European Central Bank is set to hold its policy meeting on Thursday, with markets widely anticipating a 25 basis point rate cut. Investors will also pay close attention to policymakers' assessments of how tariffs are affecting the economic outlook, as traders raised bets of rate cuts.